Thanks everyone for taking time out of their day to join us. Real quick, my name's Elliot. I work here at Zeppelin on connecting with the DesignOps community. I'm excited to introduce our speaker. As many of you may know him already, Adam Fry-Pierce. So real quick, the reason we at Zeppelin host these monthly chats with DesignOps leaders is one, so I can fulfill my Gen Z aspiration to become a podcaster, but also because here at Zeppelin, we have thousands of product teams that use us every day to ship better products from design to code more efficiently. And that also happens to be one of the goals of DesignOps, DesignOps as well, excuse me. If you're not a Zeppelin user, feel free to give us a shot and see how we can streamline your design delivery. It's free to start. And without further ado, then we'll jump right in. So Adam, I wanted to ask you, first little question for you is, how did you get here? And what's the quick story of your career?
So I've got a pretty non-linear career, and I think that should be really exciting for everybody who's on the call. Why? Because DesignOps is kind of an amorphous and emerging role. It has a whole lot of different looks and feels. There's probably the same kind of elements that you should expect in each one of these roles, but you certainly don't need to be a designer to have become a DesignOps leader. I certainly was not. Here's my quick story. So my career kind of takes three acts. Act one is it's kind of an exploratory designer. I mostly took some jobs during the financial crisis when I was coming out of college that were program management jobs, as well as mostly event management jobs, but they didn't have that title. And in that role, I was often playing graphic designer. So I managed teams and big scale projects pretty early in my career. And there was this need to kind of do what we have words for today, which is design ops. We didn't have them back then. So I was just kind of this floater amorphous designer who wasn't really great at design, but I really liked the organizational design problems that our companies were facing. So that leads to Act two, where it's me kind of in an entrepreneur role. I took all the stuff that I learned from Act one, the stuff that I really loved, the operations, design, and people work, and I was able to work with a partner, create a few different businesses, ranging from a design consultancy to a conference company, got involved at a restaurant along the way. And I just figured out that I really liked the community work and I really liked the design work. And so I continued to just surround myself more and more with really smart people all around the world at these conferences. And over time, I would kind of find this little niche that wasn't really filled out there in the conference space. We'd get together about 30, 40 different design leaders, and we just discuss a really specific topic or a shared challenge. These were usually at dinners. So, imagine long form podcast, but 30 people, wine, good stuff. And I'd eventually do about 200 of these with about 5,000 leaders. The reason why this is important is the stuff that I'm going to be sharing today is totally standing on the shoulders of giants and people far more experienced and smart than me. So I hope that I can kind of honor that and just bring forward all the stuff that I learned. Act three of my career is where I'm now. So in-house, I've been doing program management and design operations in different kind of flares and flavors since about 2017. Before that, all my design ops work was really as a consultant or a business owner. So I went in-house, started off at InVision, then DocuSign, and now I'm at Google. And along those past three companies, I've really been working in the design orgs or in design broadly. And then I've also continued, like I mentioned, working on the community work. Just 2 years ago, I joined Meredith at the DesignOps Assembly. And we were small. We were about 300 people large. And now we're 6,500 people. And I see a bunch of you are here. So thanks for coming. And that's it. So that's how I got here.
That's awesome. Yeah. And big shout out to DOA for showing up. Let's jump right into the design ops world. What are the responsibilities of design ops, and how do you see the goals of them ultimately?
Yeah. I really like, there's a colleague, Patricia, her framing of design ops always really stuck with me, just resonated. And she says something along the lines of design ops is the orchestration of people, processes, and craft to optimize design's value and help us have more impact for our broader business. I think that that's probably the best articulation of it out there. It's been said more simply by others as design ops is everything that design isn't in order to make it work in a company. That one's also a nice truncated version, but Patricia's expanded is the one that I prefer. As far as responsibilities, like I said, they range all over the place. So depending on the size of the design org, the company that you're in, whether you're consumer facing or B2B. It really can vary, but generally design ops is helping teams really do all the back end work so that designers can focus on actually doing what they're hired to do, which is their craft, right? So as far as typical roles and responsibilities, most of the time we hear, agency management, improving design process, facilitating annual planning or org design more broadly, or probably something relevant for this call, like choosing the right tool stack and optimizing that tool stack for not just designers, but also our cross-functional partners in some cases. As far as goals, these again also vary, but generally the goals can be pegged to like 6 benefits of a well-tuned design ops team. Number 1 is improved design quality. 2 is improved design efficiency. 3 is better alignment of design org goals to the business goals, which is very easy to quickly, fall out of alignment. 4, increased bottom line impact through, cost savings mostly on the business. And 5 is, thanks, Ola. 5 is designer employee life cycle. So optimizing that. So everything from like a better hiring strategy to a onboarding experience that doesn't feel like it was written by a robot, and kind of all the people operations things that need to get optimized for designers to be really satisfied with the company that they're working at. And all that stuff in that 5th bucket, they end up kind of converting into just like a healthier employee experience in my experience, at least. I will say it's worth calling out that just like product design or eng teams, that there's really a range of maturity on design ops teams as well. So everything that I'm describing kind of paints this picture of this like really well-tuned team with proper resources and respect and trust the business. But the reality is that's a pretty rare story. Design ops is emerging. A lot of the teams are in their early to mid stages of their maturity journey, and they're really typically only able to focus on like a few critical operational activities, especially right now when we find ourselves in this macroeconomic environment of convergence, which feels pretty much like a recession. But it's a time that generally there's just a lot of competition for tight resources by the companies that you would expect to stand up design ops teams, which just by the nature of this position is typically when there's enough designers that warrant a hire of a design operator.
Right. And you and I have both spoken about this, I think, previously. I think typically with companies are like growing, there's more of like a divergence as opposed to convergence. But now, like given the state of the economy, as you mentioned, there's a lot of emphasis on convergence where teams and companies are trying to maximize their efficiency and production any way that they can. So how does design ops come in here? I know that's kind of hand in hand almost.
Yeah. So the general, let's go like high level, super high level to outside of the context of a company. Let's look at the economy for a second. A lot of pretty much, I imagine everybody on this call is feeling it, but we're in an odd time, a restrictive time. Convergence is all around us. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on companies and the teams within them to maximize their efficiency and production in any way they can. In some cases, this is a direct mandate from, company leadership. And in other cases, it's kind of like an invisible mandate where we better be trying to figure out how we can save our companies money. So I think a interesting question to frame is how can we come in consideration of the macroeconomic environments? So the high level things that I like to consider is one, generally this is probably not quite over. We probably have several more quarters of this feeling, if not years, hopefully not years. The other one is outside of the context of the economy, but also nodding to another gigantic trend that we have to consider, and that's all things AI and ML. This isn't only going to just change design tools and workflows, but it's also going to reshape consumer experiences and probably society more broadly in ways that we can't even really anticipate. The third thing is competition is increasing related to the first point, but resources are tight. There's also a whole lot of startups coming out of nowhere. So competition is generally increasing in a lot of consumer facing verticals, and design is generally becoming more and more important, right? That's a kind of a really good theme of all the ones that I'm pointing at. Not that the other ones are necessarily bad, they just are. But I think this is a promising one that design still is generally looked at as a competitive differentiator. and it's becoming more
Right.
and more important to winning over your competitors.
Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
if it's helpful, I can talk about within those three things how design ops can actually help. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think if you want to dive in a little bit, go for it.
So let's take each one of those three things. Economically, how can we help? World's changing rapidly. Orgs need to adapt quickly to stay competitive. Design ops can help organizations do this by providing the frameworks to manage and optimize your design org at scale. That's kind of like the bread and butter of design operations. Two, AI and ML, how can we help here? There's a ton of ways that different design operators or design ops teams can really help out the broader business. Tooling evaluation and workflow optimization is the low-hanging fruit. And in many cases, these are going to be full-time jobs if the company is big enough. You know, at Google and at that scale, that's not uncommon. And I think that design ops is generally in a good position to organize at least like the necessary forms for the right people and the right players to come together so that they can create an aligned point of view, not just for design, but product and engineering more broadly on like all things AI, ML, ethics. What does that mean to an organization? Is that trust and safety, or is it something else? There should be an aligned point of view that isn't just up to design. It's up to everybody that's involved in building the experiences. The third one is market competition. So how can design ops help here? Orgs that are able to create great designs are more likely to succeed, like we just talked about. And design ops can just straight up help organizations improve the quality of their designs and make sure that they're aligned with the business goals. This is also worth noting that sometimes this little card that I'm talking around helping your organizations improve quality of designs, sometimes that's tagged as design leadership, which is totally fine, rightfully so, but not always. And in those cases, design ops can kind of be like the mini COO of a design org to help drive alignment, especially with cross-functional teams. The last piece, I mentioned three big factors, but kind of a fourth and just broad observation is that if you put this all together, it makes a much simpler headline, which is design ops can help save the organizations that invest in them. They can save them some money, mostly on costs, but there's also a ton of invisible things that they end up unlocking to help teams realize their upside and crank out more value exchange.
Right. That's great. Now, something I wanted to follow up on is something that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned that, design ops is everything that design isn't. But at, certain companies, I'm sure a lot of companies, they don't have design ops yet. So that kind of means design ops is kind of embedded within design. So how does design ops happen if there's not an official design ops practice or design ops specialist?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love discussing this, and there's a ton of nuance to it. The simplest way to explain it is that operations are happening regardless if somebody is staffed for it or not. So the question is, how intentional is your operations strategy and your operations delivery? So design ops can happen. Imagine like a spectrum for a second. There's either a persons, a committee, or a dedicated team that delivers on design ops strategy and delivery. In my experience, design ops is kind of the only official function that's not usually comprehensive of necessarily all of the activities that you'd expect at a company. And I can kind of help tease that out. I'll give you a real example from DocuSign. DocuSign, when I joined, there's just 2 or 3 of us that were full-time employees for the design ops team. But there was quite a few more people that were involved in some things that we would eventually staff into. And I think that that's just a great example of this kind of hybrid makeup. In a little bit, we'll start talking about this thing called the Design Ops menu, which is this like artifact that will illustrate all the different activities that a design ops team can do. And we did this activity really early to say, what things are active? Like in my first 90 days, we did this activity. So what are the things that are active? Here's a typical design ops menu. Which of these things are active and which things are ones that we are expected to do versus the ones that we're supposed to just organize our volunteers to come together and make sure that we're consulting them on their work. And that was an example of a real like lean and mean team that did way more than the amount of FTEs that we had there. And that's also one that I just encourage, just based on the last few state of design ops reports that have come out, We know that there's about 40% of teams that are less than 4 people large, or 50% even. So how do you do all the work? And there's a lot of people who feel the pains in the design organization the design operators are supposed to go solve. And that energy is typically converted into like a hand up. I want to spend like 10% of my job or 10% on top of my job to help the design ops team with some of the stuff that they're doing. The effort and energy is out there. Typically all it takes is like an invitation in an official way to make it happen. Another way that, like, you know, if you're not necessarily doing a dedicated team, how else might it happen if it's not a set of volunteers? I would say, like, generally, if there is no specialist there, whether you're an in-house person or an employee, you can analyze the activities of a design org over a short period of time and kind of map out how design ops is happening. Just a second ago, I mentioned this design ops menu. I'd like to kind of take the audience there for a second. This will be really easy for visual thinkers, but for everyone else, go with me for a second here. Imagine a table. And then in that table are these columns that are kind of your typical design ops zones. On one side of the table is kind of all things people operations and organization operations. And on the other side of the table is like practice organizations, the stuff that is typically called like design program management, helping the velocity of designers deliver value on the product teams. Using this menu, anybody can kind of figure out, okay, great, here's the stuff that's happening. Here's the stuff that is happening by an ad hoc team, or there was a temporary volunteer, or somebody's kind of taking this on as an unofficial part of their job. The point of this is that you can actually illustrate with leadership really quickly the risks that involve of, like, we're basically hooking in an entire business critical function at the will of like somebody's citizenship for our company. And that could go away at any time. And that ends up kind of teeing up this really easy conversation. Maybe the conversation isn't easy, but it dovetails into a conversation easily around resourcing and trying to create like a business case to bring on your first design ops hire.
Yeah, which I know is like a big thing, especially, you know, for new design ops practices, is getting that leadership buy-in, right?
Oh yeah,
yeah,
big time.
So I want to dive in. You mentioned like artifacts. So I want to dive in deeper there. Are there any like artifacts that design orgs use? And you mentioned one, so let's like take that for an example that allow them to have the best design ops strategy going forward.
Yeah, for sure. So I love the menu. It is something that has just really worked for me, and it's not my idea. I learned it from Brendan and a few other big design ops leaders out there. But one that another artifact that is probably more universally useful, not just for design ops, but really any organization, is this thing called the charter. The charter is you know, this has been called like a strategic planning doc. Salesforce has their version of this called the V2 MOM, but it's really just the artifact that forces everyone to align on the who, what, how, when, where, and why of the organization. Now, before this is done at the design ops level, which personally, I believe that if there's a design ops team, whether they're centralized or decentralized, they should have this for sure. But the design org has to have one in order for the design ops charter to really be sustainable over many years. So I would say if you are in a position where you're in an organization, you're looking around, you go, holy crap, we don't have a strategic planning doc or a charter for the design org. You should start there first. And you know, if that doesn't ultimately work out, sure, you can have one just for design ops, but you should know that you need to be updating it quite rapidly. These things are set up to be made and kind of revisited on an annual basis. Some teams revisit them on a quarterly basis, but it might need a little bit more maintenance if there's not like a governing charter that you're pulling down from. As far as what this looks like, there are light versions of this and there are heavy versions of this. I would say lighter is generally better. The non-negotiables for every charter, regardless of if it's staffed by, you know, a team of 40 or, you know, a team of 40 like full-time design ops specialist or 5 volunteers, I think that they generally need to hit at least a few of these points. And here they are. So number one is the why. What is the long-term mission statement that summarizes the organization's strategy? And this should be like a tweet-sized statement. The what should be an overview of your design ops activities. If, in this context, we're talking about charters for design ops teams. So your what should be the overview of your design ops activities that are currently active, as well as the ones that are inactive, but are essentially like they should be invested in the next year or two. Also worth always reminding your leadership of like the next thing that you need resourcing on. This is just a good visual reminder. That's your design ops menu. So your design ops menu essentially sits within your what of your charter. And each of these activities that are within there is usually like a program, a project, or a work stream. And if you want to see an example of this, if you just type in 5 keys to scaling design ops in Google, you'll see an article that me and my old colleague Diane had created for like the design ops menu at DocuSign. We published it. But anyways, each of the components within the cards, those are essentially projects, programs, work streams, and bonus points if you document whatever the goals of that work stream is, whatever that activity is specifically. So scrolling back up, so we're making the charter, we hit our why, we hit our what. The other thing that it should have is the who. What is the list of team members that are actually operating on the team? What are they responsible for, and how do you contact them? You want the charter to not just be for your internal audience, for whoever's on the team. You want to publish it out to all of your end users, who should be, yes, designers, but it should also be cross-functional partners as well. The last thing that should be on the charter is a super important one, and it's the when, which is a roadmap. How should your viewers understand the sequence in which your work happens in the context of the same calendar year that is pegged to the rest of the company? This charter creation exercise is, like I said, just a moment in time. Usually this takes on the span of weeks. The best of teams can lock themselves, in an onsite and be done with it in a day. But typically a little bit of marination time between when you start and end the process. It's generally helpful. Like I mentioned, though, this thing will erode. Like everything in life, entropy sets in, and that's no different for this charter. What you should have at the end of it is basically an artifact that everyone points to and says, I agree. I agree that this is what we stand for, how we do things, why we exist, who's here, when we're doing things, and what we're doing things. But, things change. So what I like to do is I like to take this charter and use it almost as like an annual planning, or sometimes like a mid-year exercise, just to throw it in front of the team that made it and say, does this still look accurate? Or is there anything in here that we need to reorder? Because prioritization is ultimately the ultimate key for long-term success. And this document has plenty of things in there that will allow you to kind of revisit and reprioritize.
So you mentioned, using like the charter as a whole as part of like annual, like a vessel for annual planning, and we can get into that in a second. But like diving deeper into like the when section of your charter, you talk about like prioritization. So you mentioned previously how DesignOps can help the entire design organization be focused on the right thing, prioritizing the right thing. So can you speak a little more on that?
Sure. Yeah, so the DesignOps activity on the menu is kind of around, there's actually a card for it in the versions that I've used, where there's, a card for strategic planning broadly for the design org. And this is kind of a common thing that happens for design teams. I think anyone that's on the call that's been part of these planning sessions, that like these typically happen in the fall. These typically do not happen in a vacuum. It's actually a big no-no if it happens in a vacuum. It should be in consideration with your cross-functional partners, larger business goals. But strategic planning is usually a set of, facilitated sessions where leadership decides what they want to accomplish in a calendar year. Thanks, Peter. By the way, just saw you in the chat. Yes, that is the presentation that I'm referencing on Brennan. But anyways, strategic planning typically happens for in the fall for the entire calendar year. It's one of the most important activities for DesignOps to be part of, as it naturally connects, all of the downstream commitments that are essentially going to need to be operationalized and actioned against. But DesignOps can be involved in this session is either the driver, where they're in charge of everything from like the programming, the pre-event data collection, live event facilitation, and all the exercises where the annual goals and the roadmap inputs are collected, as well as post-event synthesis. We actually like take all that work, polish it, hopefully working with a writer, and giving it a story that makes sense to anybody who's going to read this thing.
Mhm.
Now, not only is DesignOps running strategic planning for the session, or I should say, if they aren't involved in strategic planning, that's okay. Sometimes it's actually better if they're not facilitating. It kind of just depends on the overall dynamics of the relationship of that particular human or set of humans that are doing design ops with respect to the design organization itself. But they should definitely be involved because ultimately they're going to be informing the strategic plan in some way, shape, or form. The reason why I personally prefer that design ops is in charge of strategic planning versus a design executive is for the same reason that a design principal might be in charge of strategy behind a specific product. It's an area where a specialist can really just be responsible and maintain a key focus for the event to ensure that as minimal as bias as possible is kind of seeping into the key activities, and to ensure that the teams are aligned and that they regularly revisit the plan and reprioritize it. That's also where I've seen this this exercise basically crumble very fast. Is annual planning was done and it's never revisited. At least somebody should be pegged and the group should agree before the end of these sessions when we're going to revisit, because waiting a whole year is just way too long. I mean, just look at the beginning of 2020. Think about roadmaps that were made fall before, all of a sudden January hits, everything changed. Yeah.
So let's zoom out then to like annual planning, and how does a team identify kind of the most important activities for design ops to focus on?
Yeah. I mean, the ideal state is we take the business goals and those set the annual goals broadly, and then product teams set product goals that then support those upper goals. And then design orgs and design ops kind of set theirs. And in this utopia that I'm illustrating, all of this is happening in perfect concert to one another, and all these teams are consulting each other, and there's like harmony in the planning cycle. All the decisions are made like a song. But the reality is, like, I've never experienced that. So maybe that's just me. But again, I mentioned this community work that I've done. I've had a lot of conversations with other people that dig strategic planning. I'm personally very interested in it. I always have been. And I don't think I've ever heard it happen like that. The reality is, like, either the business or product or some team that would be your spill down goal that kind of helps you figure out what you need to focus on is behind the ball somewhere. And we've got like a particular window that, someone on the team's about to go out of office for a month and we got to do planning now. It's just kind of chaotic. So my formula is, I'll share it in a second, but it was built by people much more clever than I and much more experienced than I, and it adapts every year. But it goes something like this. I'll take known design org problems that are essentially like keep the lights on activities, and I'll draw those out from the design ops menu that I talked about earlier. And I turn all these into stickies and I put them on an Eisenhower matrix, like a simple 2x2 of importance and urgence. What I will do to inform these dimensions is we'll kind of look at the existing top line company goals that exist that I know of for the given year. They might change a little bit in the next year, or an emphasis on like different syllables, but they generally look and feel kind of the same. And then we'll take kind of our best guess at the relevant product goals that we should anticipate. And we can get close enough to understand what would be important and urgent on our 2x2 for our purposes. Then what we do is we kind of draft up an annual plan based on these inputs. We won't just take all the keep the lights on activities. I failed to mention this. Another input is we are going to be setting up surveys, hopefully company-wide surveys, but at least design org surveys where we can kind of collect everything around people, practices, platform systems, sentiment, all the things that we really want to learn about. And we'll kind of use those and we'll create these like South Star orientation moments during planning to say, here's all the keep the lights on activities that we just pulled forward from the menu. Here's some problems, regardless of what we are doing. Here are the things that we should be solving for, because our users are the designers and we need to understand those problems deeply. So we use those surveys as a way to create a very, maybe not very, as intelligent of an annual plan as we possibly can. And then we just do, that's most of the magic happens right there. And it's in just the discussion with your team of Okay, great. Based on what's important and urgent, let's throw as much stuff as that we can up here, and let's try to remove as much as we can based on capacity, which comes a little bit later on, is what do we actually have the resources to throw ourselves at these problems? And something that a lot of, I used to do, and it's a shame to admit this, but used to jump into everything that was up in that upper right quadrant and say, we're going to go ahead and just tackle all these things. We know what to do. These problems end up converting into X solution. What I have learned to do, which has been wildly advantageous, and any researcher on the call is going to say, how dare you not do this sooner, is you take the things that are up in that upper right quadrant, assuming that you have the capacity to do them, that they're above the line, you have the resources, sure. Before jumping into solutioning, I highly recommend recruiting some researchers to help you understand some of these problems a little bit more. There are known knowns in there for sure. There are also unknowns in there, and there might actually be root problems that aren't even close to being articulated based on surveys they're talking about. So really understanding those problems that you're building solutions for, it's a design principle that we should be pulling forward as design operators 100% of the time. It is so tempting for a person like me, and there are other types of humans out there in these roles, but I find that there's kind of a lot of these folks that tend to want to do everything quickly and add velocity, and velocity is the way that we're going to measure everything, including our own programs. Hesitate about jumping into a solution, understand the problem deeply first. And that might mean having to advocate and challenge some of your peers in design leadership to say, I know that we really want to build this program, but are we confident that we're actually going to be solving the right thing? If not, if we can't build consensus on that, and the way to test that is, what are we going to measure? If we solve this problem, what are the North Star needles that we should be adjusting?
Right.
If there's no consensus there, we need to understand those problems more, and we need to ask some researchers to help us understand those problems more. Anyways, that's a very, I went down a rabbit hole right there in the annual planning and prioritization moment, but it's so important. But ultimately at the end of this, what you really are trying to get to, like the thing that you're really moving towards, is this document that everybody can look at and agree upon and say, these are the right things in the right order. We can resource these. These are the right problems to solve. We have confidence on the solutions that are set up, and we don't have confidence on another set of solutions. And we're essentially going to be building discovery into those work streams to make sure that we're not building anything that is not going to be unuseful. And that's it. You reach consensus with your group. You have a plan. At the very end of it is assigning roles, which this kind of goes back to an earlier question you asked, Elliot, which is, what if you don't have a full team? This is super important. You want people to kind of be on the hook and accountable to at least come back to a group on answers. So you should agree on rituals, who's driving, which are the questions you're trying to come back at before you start building, or if there's building that's starting. All the dependencies that are necessary to do that build are also documented. It sounds like it's a heavy documentation moment. I realize that sounds kind of lame, but it's super important, because memory is fickle, and saying something on a call is cheap. What is not cheap is getting a document that can be socialized with leadership above you. And that also puts a lot of skin in the game. And that's important in something like this.
Definitely. And like moving forward from like the annual planning prioritization, like the kind of the flip side of that is, like, we've got the plans now. How do we measure like our impact? So I guess, like, just from like a broader sense, moving forward, how do you know if you're effective with like everything that you're doing?
There's the invisible stuff, like smiles, which is great. Like, people satisfaction is huge. And generally there's a ton of invisible things that folks that are more experienced in this area can probably point to. But generally, signs of trust and respect are something to keep an eye on. It's not going to be something that I talk about, but it is a huge marker of if you're even solving the right problems, because not everything that matters can be measured. And trust is one of those things that we try to quantize, but it's not perfect. As far as the things that do matter that can be measured, let's talk about that. So, tied to the annual plan, the annual goal, there should be a North Star metric agreed upon with stakeholders, or a set of North Star metrics that the design ops team is accountable for. So I'm going to tell you about a time where this was really successful. recent design ops role that I was in before Google, we had identified 4 objectives, and each of those had 4 North Star metrics. One of them was team health. We had a larger design ops team we were working with here. One of them was team health and satisfaction. So our North Star metric in that situation, ENPS. Not perfect, but it was something that we had that was embedded into the company survey. So we knew that we were going to get the most representation of our organization here, just based on the incentives associated with that survey. Another one was productivity. Our North Star metric was, again, imperfect, but it worked for the time. There are
not just velocity.
Yes, which was maker and meeting time, which I realize there's some controversy around that now. But at the time, we had to pick something, and that's what we ended up picking. Another one was team output. So experience quality measured through CSAT. Again, these are imperfect metrics, but better to have something that is shared with our product partners, which in this case, CSAT was a shared metric between design ops, product ops, and product and engineering. So it was a great North Star metric for all of us. The last one was career growth. We happened to be in a team that had some people operations flair to it as well. So our North Star question, again, on that company survey was, it had to do something around confidence that the company is continuing to invest in their own personal talent development, mobility. And so that was the question that we tied onto. It's also worth noting that I've been part of more teams that don't do the stuff that I'm talking about, or consulted with more teams that don't do this than teams that do. It is a really difficult science and art, this thing called strategic planning and delivery planning. They take a lot of time to perfect, but they're really kind of critical in order for us to really intelligently do what you're asking, which is how do we understand if we're having impact? There are smaller KPIs that are going to be embedded into work streams, of course. Leading and lagging indicators, those are always going to be localized and nuanced. But more often than not, there should be a number or a set of very important North Star metrics that matter to the design org. And that's what I would just really drive, is put some emphasis on getting alignment with your stakeholders there. I want to be mindful of time. I don't know if there's interest in telling another story. I just saw a question come up around consulting. Happy to talk about how, for all the people that are on the call who maybe aren't in a full-time position, but either are consultants, that's their job, or maybe they're looked at as like an in-house consultant. Happy to talk about that if there's time for it. But if you want to move on, we can do that too.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I think we can move a little forward, maybe.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, we can always follow up. Yeah.
Sure.
So I know that, you mentioned, I guess, like in our previous conversations, you mentioned like through engagement, there's a lot of like pain points that design ops can help with. So, and I know you mentioned previously, like tooling is one of those areas. Can you describe like just a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So again, going back to the menu as kind of our calibrator, one of the entire sections in there is all things platforms and systems. There are some teams that do this by committee, which is fine. The most effective teams will full up staff the tooling position. I'm not saying that is the common case, but everything from what is our unified tooling strategy broadly, like what are the tools that our designers want to use versus what are the tools that are actually like within compliance. Just that piece alone is so difficult for an enterprise team to go through and evaluate and figure out the risks involved and the dependencies. And then, pricing is much, much further downstream. But the reason why I tend to really like tooling is an area to focus on is the business case will kind of write itself. If you're successful, let's take like all the activities over an entire calendar year. We already mentioned some of them: evaluation, understanding what your designers want, and then figuring out actually the in workflow impacts of all these tools is a whole nother one. There's just so much low-hanging fruit here that you're going to be able to articulate very clearly in dollars, which matter to the company that's investing in you with dollars. So the thing that I like is I actually would like to share a quick story. This is a story from when I was consulting, but we essentially had like just a team of volunteers who was doing design ops. And
Mhm.
they had a little bit of extra volunteer effort, and they were ultimately trying to answer this question, Elliot, of like, who do we hire first?
Mhm.
I'll Tarantino this. They eventually hired somebody that was the tooling specialist.
Right.
But to make that business case, here's what they did. Very similar to what we just talked about, kind of in the abstract. There was about 40 designers in this organization. They threw a small subset of people to create this business case to figure out what are the tools that our designers want right now that
Mhm.
are live in the market, but also what's the what's the stuff that's coming down the pipeline. This is like right
Right.
before I won't say their name, but another tool company like went nuts, and there was a lot of like hype around like what could it do, right?
Mhm.
And ultimately, it was probably a good thing that they didn't invest in it because it was vaporware,
Mhm.
essentially. But they put this entire business case together that showed
Mhm.
all of these different pilot tools that were used. They started recommending some deprecation of those that weren't used as much. And the business case wrote itself. Zeppelin is actually part of this tool chain.
Right.
That's when I
Right.
first learned about y'all. And the business case just really wrote itself out. Here's how much we can save from reduced tool spend. Here's how much in cost per employee with employee growth over the next like 2-3 years that were
Mhm.
projected at the time. That how much they're going to be able to reduce the amount of tool spend per employee. Here's how productivity increased, and they were measuring that specifically through bug reduction, which again was, you all were part of that story. And then
Mhm.
even more employee satisfaction also ticked up, which was unanticipated in something that was just kind of thrown out as a, hey, can we also just like do a baseline check?
Right.
That annual survey was coming up, and there was already a question in there around, do you feel like you have the right tools to do your job? And we
Mhm.
saw a noticeable uptick in the crosscut of the design org specifically after this exercise. What that ended up
Right.
doing is it got truncated into a business case, and that business case led to the first hire. That first hire ended up like kind of doing that entire systems pillar.
Mhm.
They went further out, started doing agency management, vendor management, more like bottom line cost savings involved.
Mhm.
And then that ended up creating like the permission to kind of hire into the softer stuff that's a little bit more invisible, but definitely matters to designers. Like, can
Mhm.
we do it? Can we do a summit? Can we do like some lifestyle stuff that makes us feel a little bit more
Right.
connected as employees?
Mhm.
Typically on the design ops, but is hard to make a business case to like hire a people ops flavor of design ops
Mhm.
if there's just a ton of speculation around the actual business impact. So I would recommend start with the business impact first, or start with known problems that are so loud to the business they can feel in
Mhm.
a dollar argument, and then you kind of build off that.
That makes sense. Yeah. Real quick, I want to touch on something before we get to our last question. I know we're kind of past time here, so if everyone can stick around, we're going to do question and answer real soon. So if anyone's got questions, feel free to use the Q&A. I want to touch real quick. You mentioned kind of driving like the dollar efficiency of a tool, and like that kind of ties into like the whole convergence aspect, right? Of like you want to get more streamlined with your spending. And so this is kind of something that I think resonates with Zeppelin. We're historically thought of as a design tool, but it's not just for designers. It's also, as a collaboration platform, it's for like PMs, QA, developers, etc. So that kind of, I guess, ties in with, in your mind, do you see like having a tool that is more universally adopted than just like beyond one function? Like that's something that needs to be kind of like the norm going forward?
It's really hard to say because I have no clue how workflow is going to end up getting impacted
Mhm.
in like 2, 3, 4, 5 years with AI and ML broadly.
Right.
But I think a general first principle to pull from is durability, right?
Mhm.
If we invest in something today, especially just because of the buying and procurement process of large organizations, those cycles are so long and complex, and there's a lot of people involved. So durability is generally a first principle that I would pull forward. Usefulness is another one, which our designers, our users should tell us directly what is the
Mhm.
most useful for you.
Right.
But then also usefulness can probably have another slice to it, which I think is what you're touching at, which is
Mhm.
useful is not just what our designers want. It's also what's going to work within the context of our cross-functional partners. That might
Mhm.
even be more important. And that could
Right.
be unpopular to say. So as far as like use cases, of course, if a tool is flexible, also something that I think everyone who's been involved in something like this has seen is that when you bring on a tool, there's super interesting use cases that will come out of it. Maybe
Definitely.
completely by unintended audiences, right?
Mhm.
And that's in some cases why if a flexible tool is brought onto into the tool chain, it might end up being way more valuable than the initial study had thought of. So yeah, durability, usefulness, pull up those two first principles. I imagine that you're going to have like a flexible tool that comes out of it.
Right.
I could also see a very rigid single use case, but super critical tool also fall into that. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So one last question then before we
Sure.
like open it up for Q&A. I want to talk about scale for a second. You know, you've gone from companies of, you know, very varying sizes. So over the course of that, I guess, how does DesignOps change as like a function of the company's size?
Yeah, generally, the larger team gets, the more that there's like a very obvious need for design operations. So
Mhm.
as the company grows in headcount, generally so does its systems, and rarely are these systems built with any sort of long-term sustainability plan and consideration of each other. So workflows clash and redundancies happen. Entropy sets in. We see waste in the form of inefficiencies, time, frustration, and even hard dollar spend. And things like competing tools. When these pains get so obvious to leadership, they look around for opportunities to save the company money, deliver more business value, and that's typically somewhere in that journey. That's about where we see design ops or sister teams like design ops, TPMs, prod ops. It's
Mhm.
when we start to see them crop up. So the long story short is when ops problems arise, ops teams or ops specialists are typically brought in to solve those problems.
Right.
It's kind of why we rarely see operations teams at the onset of let's say like a small startup. Is it's kind of just expected that the core team, the designers, product, and engineers are kind of absorbing it. At one point, there might be a specialist that helps that entire product, that squad, operate a little bit faster. But as far as scale goes, once we see about 20 people in a particular design organization, that's generally when like it's kind of hard to ignore not having a specialist on board. There are people that I trust deeply that make a lot of sense when they say when that team gets to be about 5 people, that's when you want to
Mhm.
start bringing in somebody from the beginning. The main reason that I'd like to underline there is the idea of compounding is incredibly hard for like humans to wrap their head around. We usually
Right.
talk about it in money, but it's also invisible in systematic inefficiencies, which cause
Mhm.
tons of frustration. And that leads to things like frustrated employees who just don't show up in the same way, aren't as productive, maybe leave. The amount of problems that come out of not early enough operations investment is the story. And
Mhm.
I'm looking to better storytellers than I on the call who are listening. If you want a good book or a TED talk or something, hit that point because I'm pretty sure that you're going to see the case for operations to be invested in earlier crop up much quicker.
Mhm. Oh yeah, that makes total sense. So I guess now I'll turn it over to some questions, not from me. I'm sure everyone's getting sick of hearing me ask you questions. Um, but I guess one question, yeah, from Lorenzo is, do you see design systems, like we haven't really touched on it through this talk, but do you see design systems like as a core part of design ops, or like what is that like, I guess, relationship like between the two?
Yeah. So out in the industry, I've seen plenty of design systems teams that are built in parallel or were built much earlier than the design ops team, and they're very successful. I've seen the flip of it as well. Design ops team systems comes in later. I don't think that there is like a silver bullet answer. But where I have seen it work really, really well is when design operations is at least a very close and consulted partner to the design systems team. Or I've seen it happen where the design system team is essentially accountable to the design operations team. The next most common layout that I've seen, and I see Peter Merholtz on the call. I'd actually love to hear his perspective in the chat. Um, I've seen design systems and ops essentially be kind of two sides of a coin that then go into the leadership team. And they're essentially like making sure that their design executive is well informed. But Yeah, my philosophy is like it really just depends on the company type and the localized norms. For me to say, yeah, design systems should totally be part of design ops. I think it's way more nuanced than that. For like there to be a single answer.
Mhm. Right. That makes total sense also. Sorry, Jay, yes, we're gonna get to your question right now. So one of the top questions that we had so far is how would you differentiate design ops from design management? It's kind of something
Such
you
a great
talked about, I
question.
guess, in that table. Yeah.
It's a great question. I love this question. So the bummer about this is that there's a ton of overlap between like the universal definitions that are out there. The one that I like to say is, managers are leading organizations and they're in charge of making sure the organization is successful through its people and its broader success strategy. How does our organization win? Operations is taking a very specific slice of that, is say operationally, how can we create an organizational advantage? And that's the
Mhm.
difference. Is it's almost like it's a small design ops should be answering a smaller subset of that question of how do we succeed? And their entire split should be operationally, how do we succeed? And if we're super, super good, how can operations differentiate our entire delivery vehicle so that like our
Mhm.
people want to work here? That's the biggest
Mhm.
difference. And so if design management very clearly delegates that problem to a team, and if they're
Mhm.
smart and resourced people, they will make it. They will be able to help make operations a differentiator for the team. But that's how I like to
Okay.
split them up.
Would you see like design management as kind of like the top level then, and it goes that funnels down into design ops, or?
Yeah, that's how I tend to see it. It's at least in the world
Mhm.
where there's like other ops teams, like product ops, and I mean, I'm looking at the scale of like an enterprise, right? In
Right.
smaller organizations, I've seen a centralized product operations team where design ops is embedded into there,
Mhm.
which totally works. But at the scale of the
Right.
like, company that
An
I'm in right
enterprise company.
now,
Yeah.
management is like look at like the user experience management is like the CEO, and your operations leader is the COO
Mhm. No, makes total sense.
of
Okay, I think.
just design. I wasn't saying of like the CEO of the entire company. That's not what I
Oh,
meant.
yeah, 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 for sure. Our CEO is a designer.
Oh, of
Anyways,
course.
yeah. Thank you, Adam, for hopping on. We're gonna wrap it up now, as I know we're well past time. So thank you everyone for sticking around. Thanks, Adam, for sticking around. I know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to. If you want to reach out to us on Twitter or on LinkedIn with those questions, we can follow up with Adam and try to get those answers back to you. So
Cool.
with that, I think that's everything. Adam's always great talking to you. So have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Elliot.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good one, guys.